Let's do this.
Hello, Dr. Mantz. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well, Jim. How's it over there in Australia?
It's sunny. I think I'm getting more tan as more of these videos go by.
I have noticed that. I was like, wow.
I'm kind of proud of that. 10 years in living in Seattle, yeah, I was hardly ever in the sun. So like now I'm taking advantage of it. So it's April 21st here. Now we're more than a month in self-isolation. The news actually looks good in Australia. They're starting to reopen schools because there have been very few cases. And looking at the news in the US, maybe they'll start to reopen things sooner or later, but there's still a lot of cases of COVID. So we're in for some more self-isolation, unfortunately.
It looks that way.
And so I guess today I had a few topics to talk with you about, ranging from, how do you stay positive, to maybe a little bit of looking forward to what might be some of the like mental health problems to navigate because of this crisis, both on like a personal but like societal level.
Sure.
So to kick it off, I guess like one question I've had is it along the lines of staying positive, and how can we cheer people up that we live with or that we call? So for this question, it's like a bit motivated by my wife. She feels really bad about not being able to be close to her father, and we're in another country, and he's on his own. He's almost 80 years old, and that's a bummer, for anyone. And she feels bad about it, and I just want to be able to cheer her up. So
Sure.
When people are in that kind of situation, what kind of things could we do?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is to really, when they're feeling kind of, as you kind of put it, just in an uneasy situation, they're feeling kind of uncomfortable, is I think a lot of times is just really hear them out, is to listen to them, in that kind of state. Like, I'd like to know your experience a little bit more. Like, can you tell me what's going on in those kind of things? And that way the person can start to talk it out a little bit. And sometimes by talking it out and you're just listening and you're just being there, kind of like an open space of kind of like a mirror of sorts. And then that way that allows the person to kind of work through some of the potential areas where they may not be seeing things quite clearly, or other areas where when they just talk it out, they'll just be able to say, oh, maybe this or that. And then you can kind of just be there to support them. Because a lot of times it's really about needing that kind of sense of connection. And rather than trying to attempt to do something to them, to try to, in that case, like you're saying, cheer them up, first you have to really kind of hear what's maybe kind of bringing on the unease. And as you're kind of talking about this sort of sadness, not being able to be close to your father, and also recognizing that even if you wanted to, you couldn't go out there and meet them, and talking more about their father with them, having them relate to about what is it about their relationship that you really enjoy the most, where do you find the most meaning out of it. And so ultimately you're getting them to sort of talk about what it is that they miss about their father or mother or whoever the loved one is. And that way they can start to speak from a heart space and be able to realize, yeah, the reason why I'm feeling this uncomfortableness is because there's love there, there's care there, there's compassion there. So what you're doing is you're allowing them to kind of see the flip side of why they're feeling that uncomfortable feeling. And then, from that point, you can kind of share that compassion, the love, and you get to see that really genuine part of themselves to kind of emerge, and that will kind of bring you in too. And then you can have that kind of heart to heart there, which there's a real opportunity for healing in that way. And then allowing them, and then one could, after you explore that mode, to kind of look into certain ways of how, well, perhaps the way you're interacting with each other on Zoom, could that be brought more meaningfully? Can you talk about more things? Like I was saying in our last meeting together, I've been having more conversations with my parents surrounding death. And it's not easy, you bring that topic up and we're talking about it. We're talking about living wills, advanced directives, and that kind of things. But we've been bringing it up slowly, and I'm also addressing it on a both ways, because you never know. Something can happen on either direction. It doesn't, I could get into a car accident or some kind of other issue can happen. So you're having this sort of communication about a shared experience that we're all going to have. And that is, we're all spending a limited time on this planet, and that you can have these more depth, meaningful conversations, which is something we were lacking a lot of before all this happened. So I see this as an opportunity to really not hold back. You don't know what's going to happen. If you have an 80-year-old, parent or a loved one, and you want to be able to really share that kind of deeper connection, you might find this an opportunity to really connect on that much more meaningful way and open up the heart.
Yeah, that's one thing that I did mention to her. I lost my father a year and a half ago, and I feel really grateful that before that happened, I got to a place with him where we can have some real conversations. And having had those, I felt it helped me deal with losing him. So maybe that's, one thing that she could do. Maybe, that's nice to say to her. I also get pulled in when, she feels bad with getting into a little bit of the solver. Oh, hey, well, even if you were there, we couldn't be with him. So a Zoom call is just as good from Australia to Michigan. And like the intention is to make her not feel bad by like providing some resolution. But I don't know if that helps as much,
Well, each one you're trying to do an experiment. And I think if it comes from a place of love and heart, I mean, that's recognize and notice. And, some things may land and may provide an opportunity for you to have a kind of a nice coming together experience. Others may kind of be a dud. That's just how it is. And sometimes you as long as you're coming at it from a place of love and connection, you're not going to always, land a nice, beautiful, like, oh, that was a perfect intervention. But the mere fact that you're trying to come from a different angle, one end, and you're kind of doing a comparison thing. Well, even if you were there, you wouldn't be able to connect. So let's, so why don't we like focus on what we do have together? And that's it's a deeper point in that there are always constraints in life. There's always constraints. And so these are different constraints that are put up there. But the constraints also define the territory. It gives you an opportunity to go, all right, these are my constraints. What can I do in those constraints? And then that allows yourself to open up your creativity to do so. It's like, this happens a lot of times. I'm just going to pull a little bit of a parallel for people who might go on a diet, for instance, and now they're cutting out this food and that food. And then, but what they happen is they tend to focus on all the things that they're not eating, as opposed to, well, now let's say we're going to a plant-based diet. Now look at all the plants that you really don't normally eat. There's like 10,000 edible, plants out there that you can go at. How can we mix and match them? Let's look at the different flavors in which you can kind of arrange the things that you probably never tasted before. Spices, because typically in our American diet, our biggest things is just sugar and saltiness. Those are the two biggest ones we have. But now you have pungency, you have all these kind of, bitterness, all these different kind of compounds, these aromas. So bringing that back to the other kind of thing is like, all right, we have these constraints, but we have all these interesting new technologies that we have available that are allowing us to connect. Like I often feel like as we've been talking, a very heartfelt connection at the end of our conversations. And I find, meaning in what we're kind of expressing and doing and getting some feedback from people who have found what we're talking about helpful. So I find that helpful as well. And so those, like taking your constraints and looking how to be creative within those constraints. But again, with your person is to meet them where they're at. If you try to like, hey, let's get cheery and all that kind of stuff, and when it's not really addressing the pain. And there's also, it's okay, it's not always bad. I'd like to really tuck that off when someone's feeling down or feeling their mood is just not quite, in that kind of positive mood state and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually it's an opportunity where there's a kind of tenderness there. And if you can approach that tenderness with care, you might be surprised at what you'd be able to open up and be able to connect in a much, much deeper way. So I would just sort of lead with those sort of ideas.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting because being this much time close together is, a bit new. And I think, it sort of amplifies, the borders and margins and, places where we meet.
Definitely.
And for all of us, these are very uncertain times. And there's the positive side of that, like look at all this opportunity. Look what's, there's a lot of new things
Mm-hmm.
happening. And it's great when we're in like that mode. But there's
Mm-hmm.
also the like, what do they call it? Like the fear of uncertainty, or this is sort of maybe not a fear. And I'm gonna make this one a little bit more concrete with the example for myself around employment. It's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like a fear. It's just sort of it's kind of like lacking a set of stars by which to navigate by. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming up a year being away from a job, and then as we wrap up and come back to the United States, I was always going to go back to employment. And now this crisis hits, and basically all the rules for getting a job are completely up in the air. And I'm in a good place, and I work in tech, so like I feel very grateful that there's opportunities. But also at times I just sort of feel lost. Like, what, who's going to hire when, and what. In the old world, I felt like I sort of know the rules and I know who to reach out to. But in this sort of new world, I feel a little bit lost because the situation is changing so much, and some things might not come back, and there are always effects happen. So I guess like my question is, like, in this time of uncertainty, we talked a lot about staying healthy through sleep, diet, exercise. How do we just stay mentally positive when we get into these zones of feeling lost or even anxious about the uncertainty?
Yeah, it's definitely an important question, and it's definitely happening to a lot of people out there. And I think we're all kind of feeling that little bit of insecurity, because nothing is completely ever secure. I think that's one of the things that we kind of have this denial that, like, we have this idea like, oh yeah, we got our job, we got this, we got our house, we all, whatever it is that you might have had or even still have at this point. But this sort of uncovered a lot of the basics of life and how uncertain things can be. And I think that's one of the things that is to kind of come to terms with, is this uncertainty. And as you're kind of pointed out before, within that uncertainty, there is opportunity. And also within that uncertainty, there's the opportunity for gain and there's the opportunity for loss. And that's kind of like the balance that, we're kind of dealing with and understanding that. So the idea is, all right, what are some of the things in my life that I was doing that really could be sort of cut out, that weren't really fulfilling me? Whether that was a certain type of maladaptive behavior that, you just sort of were doing for whatever reason, and just, either through distractions or avoidance of certain things, coming to terms with those kind of things and being willing to kind of let those things go if possible. And then allowing yourself to find those things. What are the things that, when you lose track of time and you're just kind of in the moment doing things, that's a really good indicator that you're doing something, you're embodying something, a value of yours that's really important to you. And that's one of the things you want to get in touch with. Like, one of the things I kind of guide my patients with is the difference between like what resonates with you, and generally, and sensing the body as to what that is. And generally when some things resonate with us, we tend to open up more. We tend to sit up more straight, or move, or even lean in a little bit forward. Things seem a little bit lighter inside the body. Some things are more open. You feel a sense of, what I generally ask is like, from 0 to 10, what level is your level of vitality in your body? And then you can notice when that vitality even comes up just a little bit, when you feel more open, more light, more things seem even more bright perceptually. Pay attention to those little shifts, because they are teaching you what you actually value. You can't think yourself into what you value. That's like when you can do that kind of reflection afterwards. But what you really value comes from committing to small and actions, and then discovering for yourself the interrelationship between yourself and the environment, and then noticing how your body reacts, and putting your attention when your body resonates, and also putting your attention on what makes you feel resonance and what makes you feel dissonance in the body, and uncovering those. And eventually you can kind of build in what I call a sensational navigation system, where your body can help guide you. Because if you haven't noticed out there, just look out on Twitter, or look at that a lot of minds, even great minds, because we're so top heavy, they're going off into these like more and more kind of polarized directions in that way. And you're starting to see even people that you would normally say, wow, normally they're kind of on the money, but they're kind of tweaking out a little bit too far this way or far that way or whatever it might be. It's kind of like you got to get back into our bodies and use what resonates and what doesn't resonate, what's a dissonance signal, and use the resonance signals to hone in what is it that you really value. And from your value system, you develop your core values, whatever they might be. It might be creativity. It might be like loyalty might be a strong value. Love might be a strong value. Productivity might be a strong value. Whatever it might be, curiosity, it doesn't matter, authenticity. And then by having those values, they act, unlike goals, which are much more strict, like, hey, I'm going to lose 10 pounds. Okay, well, then you lose 10 pounds. You may feel good for what? A day, maybe, and then the next goal is on the line.
Yeah, or as long as you've actually kept the 10 pounds off.
Exactly.
When it comes back, maybe you feel worse. I don't know.
So, like, to put it in another term, like, a goal is sort of a finite game, but a value is an infinite game. It allows you to kind of give you it's a coherence tool. It helps to kind of take all that chaos, the uncertainty, if you want to put it in those terms, and it helps kind of make it more coherent and funnel it into what resonates with you, what gives you vitality in your life. And it gives you a compass to give you the guidance to help you to kind of track yourself during these sort of uncertain times.
Yeah. Michael, there is only one infinite game. The values things, once I took a class and I did this interesting exercise in the class where we were asked to write down our values. Mm-hmm. And then we were asked to write down what we actually spend our time doing, like where we put our energy. And the teacher made the point, okay, whatever you wrote down as your values is sort of aspirational. Where your really values are where you're spending your time and energy. And like notice the difference. And if you want to change that, go and do that. So I think that's one question came up in that description. So like in the framing of, hey, I feel like a little bit uncertain, and maybe you can navigate that by learning to read the body and pointing it towards positive direction, pointing it towards the things that draw you, the things where your values mm-hmm. lie. Mm-hmm. Question that I have is still throughout the day, these sort of like sinks of fear and anxiety, they're going to come up. And you can get better, I think, at noticing them earlier if you mm-hmm. start to become more sensitive to the body.
Yes.
So the question is, if you can start to notice these things, is it a matter of steering away from them completely? Where does the line between, like this, if I follow that line of thinking, feeling, it's just going to kind of take me into this sort of polarizing intellectual spiral, or it's going to take me into the God, I'll never get a job spiral. There's a difference between seeing that and saying like, I don't want to do that. Like if I put my energy into something else, it'll feel positive. The difference between that and maybe avoidance, maybe there's a piece of that needs to be faced because there needs to be maybe some action that has to be taken. So how can we tell the difference between those two when it comes to, I guess, trying to avoid the negative feelings at the end of the day?
Sure. Yeah. Again, there's no simple answer. But it's a very good question. And so when you're kind of going into, say, a particular thinking style, and you're feeling fear kind of building up in the body, and maybe it's something that you've thought of many times. And so you have to make that choice, whether you want to dismount from that particular thought stream, or do you want to continue on? And oftentimes what you're kind of bringing up is maybe it is fruitful to go down that thought stream. Well, if you're going to do that and you really want to really explore and make sure you're just not kind of always like avoiding, as opposed to just sort of knowing that that's a dead end and then being able to sort of dismount and go into another direction. So if you're uncertain about that, well, then you can go down that particular track. But I would recommend that you somehow write it down what you're doing, so that you're not just kind of going to fall into kind of a mental cul-de-sac of what we call rumination if you're thinking about, or worry. Worry is if you're thinking about things about the future, and it kind of circles around and you're just getting to this sort of imaginary kind of situation, and it just seems to be spiraling. Then I would be like, that's probably not going to be very helpful. Or like rumination, thinking more about like past stuff, like, well, why I did that, or resenting this person, or doing something like, feeling guilty about something else. Those are the patterns that can generally bring about worry, more anxiety, rumination, more depression kind of states. That being said, going down that line, if you're going to go explore it, then go all the way. It's like, most people, when they feel uncomfortable, they kind of stop and they kind of like go into problem solving mode right off the bat. But really, if it's fear, find out exactly what you fear, but go all the way. Go the whole distance. Like, what? All right, if I lost my job, what would that mean? All right, what could I do? What couldn't I do? And then if this wasn't going to happen, then what that mean? For me. And eventually, if you take that down deep enough, you'll start to get to understand certain aspects of like your deepest fears or concerns. Or when you take it all the way, you may notice that at the heart of it, it's really not as fearful as you thought it was. And you're not going to know until you actually take the journey. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, and that's not advice for everybody. Not everyone can handle that kind of inquiry to that depth. But for those of us who can, that can actually bear a lot of fruit to go all the way. And then, like I said, either discover that it itself is not as fearful as you once thought it was, or if there are some legitimate fears at the end, then you can kind of look at, okay, well, then now I know what I'm facing. Now I know the challenges that I might be facing, and how can I prepare for that? Are there skills? Is there knowledge? Is there people I can talk to, mentors, experts, those kind of things that I can delegate, that kind of thing. Knowing your resources, taking kind of a resource inventory that can help you address that particular challenge. Again, bringing back what I think brought up in a couple of videos back, anxiety mainly basically thrives on, big things of avoidance and or vagueness. So in that case, you're going specific, you're diving in deeply, and then you can, once you've done that, if the brain keeps bringing you down that same, kind of line of thinking, and you've done it the way that is, then at that point, it's just sort of a well-worn tire and it's not going to bear much fruit. Then I think you can be pretty safe to sure you can kind of dismount and then focus on one of your values and in those lines, and then going in that direction. But I think that would be, the way to kind of explore it for yourself. And oftentimes when you're starting to feel like you're avoiding something, you can feel like a part of you is starting to kind of close down. Like there's some sort of dullness quality that kicks in, whether it's just like the body, or you're starting to slightly kind of avoiding when there's like a little bit of a tightness, a little bit of heaviness. When you've explored something and now you're just and you're noticing that it's just a mind habitual tendency, and you're recognizing, yeah, I know where that's going. It's fine. I'm just going to dismount and go somewhere else and go, point my attention somewhere else. That generally that will be, it'll be felt like there'll be a sort of like a release that goes on in your body, some sort of form of just like a resonance in the body, like, oh yeah, that allows you to kind of go back into another direction. So again, coming back to the body can often be a useful feedback mechanism to help discern that difference.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's another, I don't know, like call it a coping mechanism that I've noticed, at least for this sort of situation that I'm in around employment. And that's it has to do not necessarily with avoidance, but with, I don't know really how to describe this in a way that's precise. It has to do more with playing with what may or may not be true and putting it into a state that looks optimistic or okay. And then not really being sure whether I'm just telling myself that as a way to accept a situation or not. So, more specifically, I guess, just to still keep it general, suppose I had a job offer and yeah, like there were some good things about it and some bad things about it. Maybe it doesn't pay well, but I get to do a new type of skill that like I've always wanted to do. And when I come to frame how I think about this job offer, instead of focusing on like the pay, which might be important, I really am focusing on, no, but this is really cool because I'm going to do the skill. And I wonder if I'm being honest enough with myself there. And like in some ways, the way I'm navigating an uncertainty is like finding this ray of light about a situation and just like going with it because that feels good. While in the background there might be some things that, you know, had I been more open and truthful about, they could come to not be like a great decision or come lead to some problem later. So to frame that up as a sort of question, how do we know we're being honest with ourselves? You know, maybe we have a lot of decisions to make when it comes to our changing lives.
Yeah.
How can we be honest?
You know, after 10 years of doing, you know, this psychiatry clinical experience of working with people with various different things, I'm naturally kind of a cognitive, obsessive style person, thinks a lot, and we see that a lot in people who tend to be studied too much, you know, having gone through medical school and all that other stuff. I have found the quickest thing to help you with that, and I'm coming back around, is that your body, see, especially the smarter you are, more likely and easy you are to bullshit yourself. That's just the way it is. The mind can just, we get really good at it. You know, that we often see this in addiction behaviors, oftentimes how good we are at just sort of bullshitting ourselves. Because our own minds, when they want sort of something and they want to avoid something else, they can sort of like just say the right things to just kind of convince you, yeah, that's what it is, you know, a rationalization of sorts or whatever else it might be that you do. So the thing is, though, what I have found with that is that if you check in with your body, even when you're bullshitting yourself, you can feel it. There's a part of you that knows it, and you know it. It's like a little hidden thing, you know, back in the mind, you know, that where you can sort of notice that there's just something quite not right about this, sort of like all of a sudden you just have this newfound like kind of energy towards something, and yeah, it's going to be like this and that, but you can get a feel that there's an imbalance in that energy. And it's like the difference when I point to people with where there's a lot of times when I'm working with people who have obsessive compulsive issues and like say compulsive doers. I work with, you know, people who are whether it's executives or people that just do, and they're very compulsive in what they're doing. They have to do well. They always have to, they kind of renege on their sleep and all that stuff. So what I wanted them to do is get the sense of what's it like when you feel compelled in your body. What's that like? What do you feel like? And compare that to doing when you're doing something you really enjoy. Like, let's say you had a person who's really like driven and they keep driving themselves, and you could just tell there's a slight imbalance in that, as opposed to maybe they also play the guitar. And when they're playing the guitar, they're just sort of enjoying the guitar. They're not trying to be the best guitar player. They're just enjoying it. And so I might compare them. I might say, well, what's the difference like in your body when you're in the flow of playing with your guitar and you're not really trying to accomplish anything, you're just enjoying it, as opposed to when you feel like I have to get this done, I must do this right now. There's a difference in there because there's a tension in the compulsive signature in the body, and all you can kind of feel like I just got to do it, and you're just driving, and there's a sort of kind of slight dampening of your just total awareness. It's just like this kind of tunnel vision that starts to build. And if someone challenges you, this is another way you can kind of discern that. Someone challenges you and you get really mad. Like, how dare you challenge my idea, my value? I'm trying to pursue my dreams and da 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 da. And it comes out like really harsh. Stop. Take a sense, you know, what's going on there, because most likely there's a part of you that's shoving a part off to the side. You might still be on the right track, but it's something to explore regardless. And that way, eventually, even when you're making a kind of difficult decision of whether to pursue something that's more of a skill building and sort of going more in alignment with your interests, and another one where, you know, and where you sort of maybe kind of reneging on your financial responsibilities. So those kind of ways of coming back, the compulsive aspect of it, noticing that sort of push, the funneling of your attention, and also if it gets challenged, that it actually dings you hard and you get a very intense sort of negative reaction. These are clues to help kind of wake you up. Be like, okay, let me just take a look at this a little bit again, and use both your mind and your body as a guide.
Yeah, thanks. I want to segue into this idea of the COVID epidemic also having a coupled mental health epidemic. And maybe one way we can get to that topic latches onto this idea of compulsion. Working in the tech world, I'm surrounded, and maybe in slightly myself, one of these compulsive doers.
Mhm.
And I'm really curious, what do you think about, and maybe even us as a Western society, like there's so many people who just feel the need to be productive and to do, and now they're isolated in their apartment and like working from home. Do you think that, like, are there ways with dealing with that? Is it about finding fruitful things to do that you sort of get that energy out?
Mhm.
Does it have bad effects? Does it, if you can't satisfy your compulsion to work really hard and get a promotion or whatever it is, do you
Mhm.
end up manifesting anger? What is this going to do to us as compulsive Americans if we can't win the marathon?
Well, it comes back to that thing of the idea of constraints. We have new constraints up. So it's asking you to adapt. It's asking you to kind of look at, all right, if you're a compulsive doer and you've learned a lot of things, you've probably done you've accomplished many different skills, many achievements and all that stuff like that. Okay, so this brings you back now to your skills that you have. And at that point, you can kind of look at, all right, I have all these kind of skills and ideas and all these other kind of things. Now, what do I do with them in this particular moment? And in that, and also, what am I doing this for? Really finding again, coming back to your value system, because a lot of times the compulsive doer is doing it in that way because they are avoiding something. And that oftentimes can be a deep kind of exploration for that particular person, and that being able to understand, like, maybe they're trying to achieve maybe they didn't get enough attention earlier on in their lives, maybe they got picked on a lot or something like that. There could be a lot of different reasons why that might be, and so there's a need to kind of achieve a certain level of status and to be able to kind of like flaunt that status, or to be able to achieve a certain amount, because inside inside of them there's a feeling of guilt or shame, or that they're not actually good enough, so they have to actually keep on proving themselves that they're good enough. Perfectionism also plays a role, like as a pattern that we see in the compulsive doer oftentimes, and there's a sort of rigidity in there, there's sort of a tightness in there. So that I would want that to be explored before I go into just how you can sort of dispense some of that extraneous energy, because that does need to be addressed. So rather than just immediately just going to an energy release, you do want to do that kind of deeper work, working with the values, working with those kind of things, finding out what really interests you, and looking at, all right, when I'm getting that compulsive drive, what might I be avoiding in that moment? And you just sort of drop the question. And these are not easy questions. These are actually courageous questions, because they're very, very tough. Very few people will be willing to do these kind of things. And these are the things that really do bear the most fruit and allow you. And they're not easy. This is not an easy road, what I'm actually pointing out to. I mean, a lot of times it's just easy to avoid and distract and just go down that kind of black, darkened way and just kind of keep trudging ahead. But if you really want to live life, if you are that type of person that want to live life to the fullest, then these are the things that you want to look and examine at. So that would be the first thing I'd like to address. Energy-wise too, it's oftentimes a lot of doers who are doing that, they may not be actually getting enough exercise for their own body, literally physically getting themselves, and sometimes then it gets channeled out where you're just kind of do. So as long as you're getting yourself some playtime, allowing yourself play, dancing, exercising, whatever it is that you like to do, that you enjoy, to move your body, get that going, doing that, it would be obviously extraordinarily helpful. I generally find the doers do best when they do that right off the bat. Let that, so that that doesn't obfuscate what is their natural energy, what is their natural vitality. That way you can then work with that at that point. So doing that, making that a part of your day, it doesn't even have to be that long. Oftentimes 5 to 10 minutes is all that for a lot of people need to do. For those of us who like to just do more, we could always add more to it. So I think letting that energy sort of having those moments, but also exploring the compulsion itself, and really just asking the question whether there is something is this part of me that's trying to do something that's really not in accordance to what I truly, truly value.
Yeah, values are so important. I've often wondered in my professional world, it seems sometimes that ambition itself has become the end. It was like, well, of course we did this. It's the ambitious thing to do rather than the mean towards achieving an end.
Yeah.
So it sort of kind of like excuses all types of behavior, and like it also ultimately leads to like people who don't really know why they're doing everything that they're doing. They just know that they have to move fast because everyone else is.
Yeah, there's this thing, in Buddhism, the hungry ghost, and where it's like they have these incredible desires, and they have like these huge, mouths and this sort of little body, and no matter what they do, they just always hungry, no matter how much they get in their bodies. So I think a lot of us are running around as hungry ghosts, just not being able to get that insatiable desire. But when you're getting an insatiable desire, when that's happening, and you're noticing that pattern, like the ambition part, it's not really according to one of your deeper values, one that would really bring about your true interest, your true parts of ourselves that maybe you're scared to show. Maybe you feel like, oh man, that makes me too vulnerable in those emotions, in those moments, and where I would like to, explore this aspect of myself or that aspect of myself, but that's not how I usually present myself, so I don't want to do that. Well, then you have to ask yourself, what type of life do you want to live? Do you want to live a life that you've kind of created this sort of construct in which it doesn't really resonate with your body? What do you think that's going to do at the end of your life when that happens that way? I mean, it's going to ultimately lead to a greater and greater amount of dissatisfaction, as opposed to really taking the courageous step, looking at the parts of us that we do avoid in ourselves. And then in that moment, when we start to notice what we avoid, you will start to notice, if as long as you don't let that inner critic come in there and beat you up for what you see, there's an opportunity to really get to know that deeper aspects of yourself, which is where that positive, powerful energy lies, that vitality lies, that will drive a kind of natural energy that allows you, where it doesn't go off balance. It's like that ambitious person who kind of does all their stuff in their job, and then they don't do so well at home. Their family life is a wreck. I mean, it's so common. It's just, I see it so often in the practice. So that would be much likely to happen, because you're just doing things because of interest, but also then because you're in tune with what you value, then you're attuned with your values in all the different spheres of your life. And it happens and becomes woven in together more and more over time, effortlessly. And then you're actually living a life that manifests your actual interest and your potential, rather than something that was a construct as a way to avoid something that might not have been fulfilled as when you were either younger or even as an adult.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You would think that a self-isolation time where maybe we have a few extra hours where we're not commuting, or maybe the work is slowed down, would be like a really good time for that type of person to take kind of a step back, ask some of these questions, and maybe develop some of these other interests. So from the point of view of opportunity, maybe that could come out of this. So the other part of this question, which is kind of going into like, where is mental health going for a lot of us, or society, has to do with depression.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess just, it's obviously a big topic, but to kind of constrain it a little bit. So a lot of us might be prone to depression. There might be signs of it forming, and then of course we're isolated, right? We don't have necessarily other people to help pull us out of it that might have naturally happened. So I guess my question is, do you feel that we'll be seeing increasing rates of depression because of this? And maybe what are some of the signs that could be forming, and what could we do about it if we notice that?
Yeah, so important, very important question. So with depression, there's many different factors that can lead someone into depression. It's one of the reasons why we don't have that much success when people treat it just with like the medications. Our medications themselves, arguably anywhere from 25 to 33% of the medications that we typically use, SSRIs, will lead to sustained remission over 12 months. And some people think it's lower, some people it's higher, but most people fall around 25, 30, 33%. Not a particularly high number. So depression is multifactorial. There's many reasons, that why people might feel that way. What I wanted to bring up, it was something that a friend had kind of relayed to me, was a person that was living by themselves, They happened to just be living by themselves, and they were getting very panicky. And now that we've gotten into that, what did you say about how long has it been now that we've been under kind of shelter in place?
I mean,
about a month?
More than a month. We arrived here in March 18th and
Okay.
had to do 2 weeks. But I think that's about the time most states in the US were actually starting to lock down, some earlier than others.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to this because it's an important thing about that highlights a form of depression that's, I think, highly prevalent and is most likely to get charged in this particular situation. And that's going back to that gentleman I was telling you about, Jaak Panksepp, and his affective neuroscience book. And he was talking about those 7 primary mammalian emotional circuitries that we all have. And the one that I want to highlight is that panic grief system. It's one emotional circuitry. It's one of the most powerful system. When we've mentioned in our other podcast, when grief happens, it lights up in the MRI when function more of the brain lights up than any other emotion. So it's an extraordinarily important emotion. It's one of our primary social emotions because when we grieve, it highlights, because it's a full body thing. We're not talking about weepiness, which is the neck above, but we're talking about that full body grieving. It shows us what we value, that that something was loved and lost. And so it's an accurate representation. It's a good signal from one person to another to see that authentic expression of emotion. Coming back to the panic grief now, is that system is a primal circuitry that was built into us. So all mammals share that. Let me bring an example where you have a lion's pride. And in that lion's pride, you have the cubs and all there. And then a cub gets lost. And then when that cub gets lost, what it will do is it will do distress calls to kind of alert, because if it doesn't get the pride to come back and support them, it's going to die out there in the wilderness. So distress call is meant to kind of tell, hey, by the way, I'm here, come find me. That's the panic part. And we have that system built into our part. So what a lot of us, when we were first going into that shelter in place, and we started to feel, I think we talked about it, where you start to, you feel this sort of rise in energy and like the kind of panicky like feeling. That was the disconnection. That was the initial stages of the disconnection that we all felt. And one of the things I was trying to highlight is that it's a very normal expression. As uncomfortable as it may be, just let it happen. Don't fight it, let it flow. Now, that cub, going back to that cub, and when it's doing the distress calls, if it's not answered after a while, it would not make sense for it to continue to make distress calls, because hyenas could be by or anything. It would alert its position to particular predators. So at that point, another system starts to kick in. That system kicks in. It goes from one spectrum, panic, and then it goes into a shutdown, grief. And in that grief experience, the metabolic rate shuts down. The whole body shuts down, the energy shuts down. You may start to feel heavier in the body. It's hard to kind of initiate things and get things going. It's like, yeah, I want to do it, but it's just so hard to kind of get things going, that kind of stuff. And you start to kind of, things look a little darker, drearier. Even your perceptions change in that particular moment. But there's nothing pathological there. That was meant to be to keep you still. Stay there, be quiet. You're that cub, you're sitting there. Because the thing is, the best place you're going to be found is where you were lost. So you don't want to be wasting calories running around searching for things. You want to just stay where you are and be in place. And so the body shuts down in that regard. So a lot of us are probably are experiencing that as this kind of goes on. We went into that panic phase. That can only last so long because there's a lot of energy that gets expended. And so after a while, there can be sort of a shutdown phase. So that's not pathological if that's what you're experiencing. Now, what can happen is if the thoughts start to go like, there's something wrong with me, this is something terrible, then that can start to create another mechanism that could lead itself into greater and greater levels of functional impairment, and then other things where it might lead into a major depressive episode. But that in and of itself, if that's happening to you, is just a call to try to really emphasize connecting as much as possible, getting out there, connecting to your values, as we brought up before, because it's like an intrapersonal connection, connecting to yourself, getting to know yourself, and then connecting interpersonally as much as possible. So if you're doing these kind of Zooms or you're reaching out to different groups, making sure that it's also meaningful, that you're not just sitting there complaining, but you have those meaningful things that we've brought up in the past, where you're actually having those deeper conversations, saying what what's your gratitude for, what are things you may want to say that you've never said off the tip of your tongue. Those are these opportunities that you want to bring out and connect with people for, and really putting yourself a little bit more out there. So those are ways that you can kind of mitigate that particular aspect by connecting out there, because I am a little bit concerned in regard of a lot of people have been doing a lot of stuff too, and like, trying to distract themselves and move on. And all the while, there's sort of like the emotions that they've been dealing with that they didn't want to deal with, they're putting on what I call the emotional credit card. So kind of put it off there, and it's building interest. Kind of like that person that during a funeral who can get a lot of stuff done, and like, wow, they're handling this so well. I can't believe that. And then 6 months down the line, when everything is like kind of dead, and all of a sudden, kaboom, like the credit card that they've been pushing off all their emotional debt onto comes in to say, all right, now it's time to pay up. And it's like a big kind of like downward spiral at that point. So that's the thing we want to try to, as much as you can, not have happen, because that's a much more difficult situation to work through, but is to allow yourself to kind of, take inventory, make sure that you're not overly distracting, avoiding difficult things, connecting to different people, doing those kind of things, taking care of your body on a physical way, as we've described many times, going out, getting sunshine, doing those things, moving your body whenever you can. If you're tired a particular day, what's called the 2-minute rule. Just do it for 2 minutes. That's it. If you do it, and if it gets you into the mode, then you can do more. But just do it for 2 minutes. If you can just do that and get yourself a little bit going, and that's it, that's perfect. Just do that. So if there's like some little rules and things like that, I think we can kind of get this started going and kind of addressing this fairly complex issue.
Yeah, thanks. It makes a lot of sense that we'd sort of all be going through that arc, and maybe some of us plunge into it. And then I wonder on like the societal level, like I think we have some societies and cultures that have high rates of depression, whether they're, too hardworking, demanding cultures, or like they're north and don't get a lot of sunlight. I wonder what we can do, because like, I think, if this were like a group response that we could have, like the thing would be like, let's go hug your neighbor, day, or like, some kind of like moment where we at least like come together. But yet in this pandemic, it's sort of the opposite. Like we responsibly have to keep away from each other.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether there'll be some creative things that we see, kind of like, like the cheering and howling and acknowledgement of first responders that people have been doing at 7 or 8 p.m. I guess, depending on which coast you're on.
Amazing, huh?
But like, yeah, like the level that can, bring connection and, keep us away from feeling alone. It's quite amazing that those things emerge.
Exactly. And what you're highlighting there, and even when, as you say it, I get goosebumps, because I can feel that energy when you're seeing like that collective response. So what is that though? Think about it. We're all clapping. We're all doing, we talked about this a little bit, about this sort of like when the person taps at the same time as you do, and then you would more favorably have an attitude more favorable to that person than the people who tapped out of sync. It's this sort of being able to be in sync with one another. This sort of what we call like this mirroring response, motor resonance, where you're getting in rhythm and sync with one another. That way you start to lose your kind of your sense of isolated self, and you're becoming a part of the whole, and you can feel it. So those things can be done I think we talked about this in the first responders video that we were talking about ways you can still connect, and we were talking about rhythm and drumming and dancing and even different like hand gestures. Like what do athletes do when you're when they celebrate on there, when they do like 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it might be that they're doing. When you do that, you don't necessarily have to touch each other. Once you're in touch with each other, you don't have to physically do it. As long as you fall in sync with each other, you could do this just as an experiment at home. It's just like, come up with a little routine as you start to do with your significant other. It's kind of like when you come up with a handshake, and it feels kind of cool. Like maybe you did that during like middle school years, and you're like, yeah, that's like my friend. We came up with our own handshake or something, or a slap. Well, you don't have to actually touch to get that feeling of like communion, that feeling of connection. You can come up with different gestures. You can do those kind of things, different types of like phrases that you could do. You could you say one thing and the other kind of replies to that, and then you kind of giggle at it. It's something that you two do. that kind of stuff. That could be done without touching, and that's a way to kind of get in sync and connect with one another.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, let's wrap up. Any closing thoughts today?
No, I just want to say how cool. I like that, how you said that's really cool, because you notice how your body reacted. It smiled, it opened up, and there was like a certain resonance, shall I say, with that. It's like, yeah, it was cool. We all smile. Like when we talk about play, when we talk about connecting in these ways with like either gesturing, syncing, and rhythm, you notice it's not something you're controlling. It's something that naturally, it's like, it almost feels like it's like radiating out, like the sort of like kind of energy that's going there. So you don't have to force positivity on there. It's just finding out what those things that allow to elicit that from yourself. And that's what I want to kind of do, is like get yourselves to kind of like, just, we came in greater touch with our body, because we always only give our body attention generally when there's something wrong with it. It's now is an opportunity to bring our heads back to our bodies. If there's anything that's calling this isolation, is to reconnect those two together.
Yeah.
And allow yourself to really experience that these sensations are telling you something. They're not verbal, but they're very, very important forms of information to listen to. So just to kind of highlight that, I'd just like to end on that note. And also, again, thank you again, Jim, for these wonderful conversations.
Yeah, it's really great. I'm smiling because I'm going to go try this with my wife right now. She's mad at me this morning. So like I have to have some strategy to get out of the doghouse. So
can you let us know?
How to do it.
Can you let us know? I mean, this is a great experiment, if you don't mind.
I'll let you know next week.
All right.
All right. Take care.
All right. Take care, Jim. All right. Bye-bye.